From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Tuesday edition as we count down to reciprocal tariffs to take effect at midnight. The markets today are rising on hopes for deals. This is Donald Trump's White House, after all, but maybe not China. Pointing now to a fight to the end. We're going to talk about the escalation with the world's second largest economy with Tom Orlik, chief economist at Bloomberg Economics. The Supreme Court just now backing President Trump on firing thousands of federal workers. The ruling just dropped. We'll have analysis from our political panel, along with Bloomberg Politics contributor Rick Davis, our Republican strategist, and Democratic strategist Kristen, Hawn. Let's get to Wall Street. This is a different look with green on the screen for Charlie Pellet in New York. Charlie, what do you have in the markets?
A very different tone from this time yesterday, Joe Mathieu. We've got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing right now. Your key takeaway at midday: we are off session highs, but still solid gains across the board. Right to the numbers with the S&P now higher by 120, up 2.4%. Have been up as much as 4%. Dow Industrials up 968, up by 2.6%. NASDAQ Composite Index right now advancing by 2.5%. The 10-year 4.20%, with the 2-year currently yielding 3.78%. Stocks heading toward the biggest gain since November. We've got the price of gold up 0.4%. Spot gold was trading above 3,000, just pulling back somewhat now at $29.95, still up $12. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.7%, 61.11 for a barrel of WTI. All about tariffs again today. As for market sentiment surrounding those tariffs, John Stoltzfus is chief investment strategist at Oppenheimer, and he was interviewed on Bloomberg Open Interest.
Everybody was in shock by the degree of the tariffs. I think everybody had expected tariffs, but it was like a big difference from Tariffs 101 at the administration's previous run in the White House, and now essentially Tariffs 401, senior year, you know.
John Stoltzfus of Oppenheimer interviewed on Bloomberg Open Interest. Levi Strauss shares are trading lower now. We've got Levi Strauss down 3.2%. It is maintaining a full-year outlook that excludes the impact from sweeping U.S. tariffs. Joe brought us the headline moments ago. Worth repeating: U.S. Supreme Court blocking a judge's order to reinstate 16,000 federal workers in 6 government departments, granting President Trump's request. A topic we'll be exploring a lot more coming up on Balance of Power. And briefly, Fannie Mae firing over 100 employees for unethical conduct. Balance of Power continues right now. Back we go to Washington. Here he is, Joe Mathieu.
All right, Charlie Pellet, there he is, live in New York. We'll get back to Charlie in a bit to check on these markets, see if we're holding positive here. As Charlie mentioned, we've seen better numbers today. But at last, some relief in a story that has dragged on days, and it's really just beginning. Let's be honest, not the market reaction, but the tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs go into effect at midnight tonight. And there are questions about, of course, their impact. There are questions about what deals, in fact, could be made as we look squarely at China today. President not making anyone happy in Beijing, now criticizing President Trump's threats to oppose this additional, remember yesterday around this time, 50% tariff, he said, reciprocating the reciprocal or something to that effect. China calls it blackmail. The U.S. threat to escalate tariffs on China, a mistake on top of a mistake, the country's commerce ministry said in a statement. China will never accept it if the U.S. insists on its own way. China, ready? Will fight to the end, unquote. That does not sound like a country that's about to make a deal. Though on Truth Social, President Trump says quite the opposite. China also wants to make a deal badly, he writes, referring to a deal in the works now with South Korea. But they don't know how to get it started, he says. We're waiting for their call. It will happen! Exclamation point. Earlier today, we heard from the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House, Stephen Myron, on Bloomberg Surveillance, had this to say.
I think that depends on the Chinese. And, my advice to them would be that they have a lot more to lose than America does, that America holds the leverage, and everybody knows that, and therefore they should seek a détente, and they should offer concessions which would persuade the president to relent.
Seek a détente, as we do right now with the great Tom Orlik. There was one voice we wanted to get to today, as this really seems to focus around China at the moment, and that is the chief economist at Bloomberg Economics, Tom Orlik, who spent a good chunk of his career reporting in China and has a good sense of the psychology right now in Beijing. It's great to have you back, Tom.
Great to be here.
I have very simple questions for you on this. Because we're actually talking about fairly simple ideas here. It's just been a very complicated reaction. What is the psychology when you hear terms like blackmail, fight to the end? How is Beijing interpreting this line from the White House when it comes to tariffs and more layers of tariffs?
So, of course, I don't have a window into China's leadership compound in Beijing, Joe. But I suspect if we could listen in on some of those conversations, China's leaders will probably be thinking, well, first, in Trump's first term, we engaged in an extensive negotiation over tariffs. We struck a deal. Yes, we didn't fully live up to the terms of those deals, but there was a COVID pandemic. Yeah. It's force majeure. Now, Trump's hitting us again, and with much higher tariffs. Is this a reasonable negotiating partner? If we negotiate in good faith once and do a deal, but that deal doesn't seem to have any traction, is there any point in us engaging in another negotiation? So I think that's probably part of the reason why we're seeing China hitting back rather than attempting to negotiate.
Interesting. Fight to the end is pretty stark. That sounds like we're not going to be reaching a deal anytime soon. Washington has a certain angle on China. It's a bipartisan affair, although this White House has a particular obsession with China when it comes to trade. Does it deserve that reputation?
So I think the idea that China has more to lose from this than the United States does is true. China has the trade surplus. The United States has the trade deficit. China is benefiting from catch-up on technology as U.S. firms move their factories and their expertise and their IP into the Chinese market. So China does have more to lose here, but China's not the only country that has something to lose in a trade war.
Sure.
Think about the U.S. firms, which have supply chains across China's east coast. Apple being a prominent example. Think about the US consumers who've grown used to being able to pick up their clothes and their sneakers and their electronics at bargain basement prices. And think of the investors who've been making big bets on this relationship staying in place. There are some pretty important US constituencies who are going to be losing out here.
Well, that's right. I mean, you could argue we wouldn't have Walmart without China, right? We wouldn't have cheap appliances without China. We'd be paying $3,000 for an iPhone without China, or some of the countries that have seen spillovers with Apple and so forth trying to relocate some manufacturing. But this is why people are talking about upending the world economic order. Without China, do we not pay more for everything?
Well, I think the president, if he were here in the studio, Joe, would say we'd also have more of a manufacturing industry if it weren't for China, right? So there's two sides to it for everybody.
But our labor is much more expensive.
The labor's much more expensive, but maybe it's worth paying more for our consumer goods, the White House believes, if that guarantees a future for the U.S. manufacturing industry, a path to a stable middle-class life for U.S. workers, and locks in our national security, right? Part of the argument here is not about economic efficiency and profits and market gains. It's about recognizing that China's a geopolitical rival. And do we want to be so dependent on a geopolitical rival for crucial inputs?
Sure. Well, you talk about high-end manufacturing, advanced manufacturing. I understand the drive there. When you're talking about making socks or sneakers, is that really what we want to bring back to this country? What would our economy look like?
I think that's a great question, Joe. So I used to live in China, and I visited some of the manufacturing centers. I've seen what it's like working in a factory that snaps together iPhones or sews up sports gear. Those are great jobs if you were working on a Chinese farm, because by going into the factory, you're doubling, tripling your income.
I see.
Are they a great job if you're a US worker?
Yeah.
Do you want to work in those conditions? I think there are some questions there.
Well, I'm sure that's true. As a go forward, you look at this truth post from Donald Trump that I was reading. He seems to think that a deal with South Korea would unlock a deal with China. In fact, says their top team, South Korea, is on a plane heading to the U.S. and things are looking good. We're likewise dealing with many other countries, all of whom want to make a deal with the United States, and he points to China. Could some motion in the region, South Korea, Japan, in fact, unlock a deal with Beijing?
So I think there are some really important differences between South Korea and China when it comes to their relations with the United States. So the first one is South Korea is a U.S. ally, and South Korea relies on U.S. troops as part of the deterrent against North Korea. Exports are also incredibly important as a driver of South Korea's growth. They really can't do without export markets. So for security reasons, for economic reasons, for treaty reasons, you can understand why South Koreans might be wanting to get on a plane to Washington, D.C. None of those things apply to China. China is not a U.S. ally. China is in many respects a U.S. adversary. Exports are important for China's economy, but not nearly as important as domestic demand. So they take a hit here, but it's nothing like the size of the hit which South Korea would take. So it doesn't surprise me that some mid-sized economies like South Korea should be picking up the phone. Does that mean China's going to be picking up the phone? I'm not holding my breath.
Wow. This has been a clinic with Tom Orlik. In our remaining moment here, Vietnam, accused of laundering Chinese goods through its country, and they end up here evading tariffs, essentially. Do tariffs stop that kind of behavior? Is Vietnam caught in the middle?
So think about the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2. Trump 1, China got hit with tariffs. Vietnam didn't get hit with tariffs.
Right.
Mexico didn't get hit with tariffs, right? That's a world where if you're a bit crafty, you can game the system,
Does
right?
this change that behavior?
Let's send the ship to Vietnam, and then on to the US, and then we can dodge the tariffs. If everyone gets hit with tariffs, that game doesn't work anymore.
Boy, fascinating. I hope we can stay close with you on this, because the next couple of days, it sounds like will be critical here in the region. Tom Orlik, he's the chief economist at Bloomberg Economics for a reason. And great to have some time, Tom. Thank you so much here on the fastest show in politics. Nathan Dean is on the way in next from Bloomberg Intelligence. We have a lot more to talk about here on the Tuesday edition on Bloomberg. You know, things are weird when Ted Cruz and Elizabeth Warren are agreeing on things, and that's the moment we're at right now. When it comes to tariffs, strange bedfellows. As Ted Cruz criticizes President Trump's tariffs, talking about angels and demons. I fear we had the wrong characters cast in this little drama that we were creating here, or metaphorical drama at the White House, with the idea of Peter Navarro on one shoulder. And now Ted Cruz says Elon Musk is on the other, talking to Donald Trump about tariffs. It's not Scott Bessent. He's over the Treasury Department trying to get the 10-year yield lower. Elon Musk appealing directly, we now understand, to Donald Trump in advance of these tariffs taking effect tonight. Ted Cruz agreeing with him, praising Elon Musk, who hopes for a free trade zone between the U.S. and Europe, describing him as one of the angels on President Trump's shoulders, focused on jobs. Enter the senator from Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren. Says all you have to do is exercise your own authority here on Capitol Hill, and we've got the tariffs taken care of. That is the purview of Congress. And she joined us last evening on the late edition of Balance of Power to make the point that simply passing a resolution, making it clear that this emergency that Donald Trump is referring to base the tariffs on is in fact not applicable here, and we'd be done. Is it that simple? Here's what Elizabeth Warren told us.
If Congress says, no, there is no emergency here, then Donald Trump loses his ability to put all of these tariffs in place. So We need to act. We need a Secretary of Treasury to do his job. The Democrats in Congress are ready to act. But if the Secretary of Treasury won't act, then we need the Republicans to step up, join the Democrats, and put a halt to these tariffs that are truly wrecking the worldwide economy.
Well, Senator, the president argues it's going to help the U.S. economy, that this is actually about bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., protecting American workers, and lowering trade deficits with other countries. Is there something fundamentally wrong with that objective, or it's simply the means that you take issue with?
The objective is exactly one that I have advanced for years. Of course, tariffs should be one of our tools in the toolbox of economic policy. And there are times when appropriately executed that we could use a tariff, for example, to onshore a specific supply chain or to help build up manufacturing that we want to have here in the United States. But you do that in a thoughtful, integrated way. Instead of a haphazard number around tariffs applied to everyone with no thought at all about whether or not those tariffs will actually have a negative impact on manufacturing that's currently going on or any manufacturing that anybody might try to get underway. Instead of actually supporting manufacturing and good jobs, the way Donald Trump has done this has been to scare off anybody from investing here in the United States in any kind of facility that takes years to be able to build and expand and get it going. He's forcing people to pull back. That is not good for American workers. It is not good for building jobs here in America. It is not good for onshoring our manufacturing. You need a thoughtful policy, and that is the opposite of what Donald Trump has offered.
The take from Elizabeth Warren, Democrat from Massachusetts, with us on the late edition of Balance of Power yesterday. Nonetheless, you can put the countdown clock up because the reciprocal tariffs, the president says, are taking effect at midnight. It's anyone's guess what happens after that, with now, according to the Treasury Secretary, 70 countries reaching out for negotiations. You know, we live here inside the terminal. If you're with us on YouTube, you see this backdrop. Just imagine us inside the terminal. It's almost like the severed floor. Only subscribers can get in. But Nathan Dean is our window to the world. He actually has the line to the outside. Clients who are calling in with questions, with concerns, with fears. There's only one guy you call here. Bloomberg Intelligence senior U.S. policy analyst, if you want to really know what's happening. His name is Nathan Dean. It's great to see you, sir.
Thanks again for having me.
The phone's not stopped ringing. What is the real concern here? Markets are up today. I know we're feeling pretty good about things, but these tariffs are still kicking in at midnight. Nothing's really changed.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest question we're getting from clients at the moment is, will President Trump reverse his policy? And I think if anybody's watching the Senate Finance Committee hearing this morning, you know, the answer is most likely not. Mm-hmm. You know, the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer was very adamant that this is a long-term plan. You know, the long-term gain for short-term pain is what he was saying. And so we do think these tariffs are going to go in, but we always put it with the asterisk of President Trump loves to negotiate. And even in that same committee hearing, you know, Ambassador Greer was saying, you know, we're working with 50 countries at the moment, 50 countries that we're working on trade deals. And I think that's what the market is really looking for. And we saw some, you know, lawmakers from the Republican side say that as well, is, look, we need some sort of end game here. You need to tell us where this is going. What is the plan? Mm-hmm. And I think that plan starts with trade deals. So I wouldn't be surprised if these tariffs go into fruition, but I also wouldn't be surprised if you see a trade deal emerge over the next day or two, if not sooner.
Yeah, Jamieson Greer, USTR, sitting for a hearing, actually 2 days worth of hearings, first day in the Senate today. Let's listen to what he had to say about these countries we're dealing with, because it doesn't sound like we're about to make deals when you listen to Mr. Greer. Here we go.
The president has been clear, again, that he's not doing exemptions or exceptions in the near term. My own sense is, given the tariff differentials between Asia and Western Hemisphere, I think people can start making decisions based on that.
So when you hear no exemptions, Why are we talking to 50 countries? Doesn't that sound like 50 exemptions coming?
Well, I mean, and I would also just put his comments in the greater context of, the Trump administration where, he's not just the only person. And remember, it is President Trump at the end of the day who decides what the policy is, and there could be exemptions. It's very hard for the U.S. Trade Representative to combat Apple and Tim Cook if Apple and Tim Cook were to go into the White House and ask for an exemption. Look, I'm not saying there will be exemptions, but it's just difficult when there's other things here to play.
Sure.
But I would also point out is that, when it comes to these negotiations and so forth, there's going to be ramping up political pressure from the Republican side if we begin to see this impacted at the consumer level. Senator Tom Tillis, up for re-election in 2026, had some fairly strong language for Jamieson Greer in that hearing.
Yes.
And I'm paraphrasing here and said, who am I going to hurt if... if this turns out wrong, obviously we don't think the Republicans are going to push back on the Trump agenda right now. But if this continues over the next few months, you may see more and more Republicans coming.
We wrote that up. It's on the terminal. Tom Tillis, whose throat do I get to choke if this turns out to be wrong? Republican, North Carolina. Is he just trying to get tape on himself to be caught saying this at the right time if this does, in fact, go south?
Yeah, I think a little bit of this is political. I mean, obviously, we saw bipartisan legislation last week from Senator Grassley, Iowa, farm state, very important for farmers and ranchers, teaming up with Senator Maria Cantwell, that would bring back the authority of a president to impose tariffs and put it back in the congressional side.
Yep.
Now, that's not going to go anywhere. I don't think the Republican leadership has any desire to touch it, and President Trump said that he was going to veto it. But, it did get a couple of bipartisan supporters, and I think if this trade war were to continue over the next few months, you could probably get a little bit more and more, because ultimately, and this is where we feel, is that we don't think President Trump is going to respond to Wall Street. Jamieson Greer said the exact same thing today, that Wall Street's not going to dictate this outcome here. But if the consumer confidence levels and things for food and Apple electronics and other things begin to go up dramatically, then you potentially could see much more Republican pushback.
You start wondering if the real trade war is happening inside the White House now. This stuff between Peter Navarro and Elon Musk is wild. I can't even read the tweets on the air. That's how chippy that got this morning. So clearly, not everyone agrees, even inside the White House, inside the administration on this, making you wonder how fluid this whole conversation is and whether it complicates what's happening on Capitol Hill. The Speaker wants to get a vote by tomorrow, I understand, on this this framework here, the budget plan that passed the Senate. Donald Trump takes to Truth Social again. The House must pass this budget resolution, and quickly. There are a lot of Republicans in the House who are not prepared to vote yes on this.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if this takes a little bit more time. I mean, tomorrow is pretty pretty
ambitious.
Quick. Yeah, ambitious. That's the perfect word here. But what I would say is that I do think Speaker Johnson, and we also heard this from Representative Jim Jordan, when they're going around telling their members, look, this is just a blueprint. This is just to keep the process rolling.
Yes, right.
I think that's easy for Republicans to eventually grasp on and say, look, rather than incur President Trump's wrath right now, let's save it for when we actually have specifics. And so when things like SNAP, the Inflation Reduction Act, Medicaid, when those cuts potentially come up, then we'll actually fight. But for us, we think the process will continue. And ultimately, we think the Senate plan is the one that Congress is going to gear towards, because if the current baseline policy, meaning this $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, you effectively are free or the cost of zero, then you don't have to cut SNAP. You don't have to cut the IRA. You don't have to cut Medicaid. You can essentially just have to deal with deficit hawks at that point. And I think it's much easier for President Trump to go down to Capitol Hill and say, look, are you going to derail my plan? Because if so, let's talk about it now, and I'll make sure that Elon Musk and everybody else in the world is aware of it.
That's right, and he'll be tweeting, Elon, that is. They're actually going to be at the White House, a half an hour from now. There's a meeting, Republicans from Capitol Hill talking to Donald Trump about this, so let the public pressure begin. We're out of time. Has Wall Street ever thought worse of Washington than right now at this moment?
I'm not sure Wall Street has many views on, or they have many views on Washington.
Not very good ones, though. I mean, the calls you're getting, people sound desperate, right? They're angry. They want to know what the problem is in the federal city.
All they want is clarity. That's it.
See if we can ever find it. With the help of Nathan Dean. Great to see you, as always. Bloomberg Intelligence, find him on the terminal and online. Senior U.S. policy analyst. If you're a client, give him a call. In the meantime, we'll assemble our panel. Rick Davis and Kristen Hawn are straight ahead with a Supreme Court ruling today and tariffs about to take effect at midnight. We've got a lot to talk about. The fastest show in politics on Bloomberg. As we keep our eyes on the markets here, Not exactly the most impressive run after a 1,000-point plus rally first thing. The Dow's chopped that number in half. The S&P 500, as Charlie mentioned, certainly well off its highs as well, making a lot of people wonder if this is real, a dead cat bounce, or the biggest short squeeze in recent memory. And the reason why we're asking is because nothing has changed on the tariff front. There is apparently some optimism for deals being made. The White House says that countries are calling, 50 to 70 of them, depending on the cabinet secretary you hear from. But no deals have been made yet. They will take effect at midnight. Reciprocal tariffs, the baseline tariffs already in place. It's an important Supreme Court ruling that does not have to do with tariffs, aimed at the Trump administration today. In fact, this has been an interesting period of time here with another Supreme Court ruling that favors the administration. In fact, there have been a couple here, third time in less than a week. The Supremes have backed Donald Trump's actions. In this case, it has to do with firing federal workers. Doesn't that seem like a story from a long time ago? It's just a couple of weeks, in fact. There were 16,000 federal workers in 6 government departments. Many cases, probationary workers. They were just coming in. They hadn't gotten their tenure yet, if you will, and told to pack up their desks and leave, the door locked behind them. This went through a series of courts until it reached the highest, the Supreme Court now, and this happened just as we were taking air at the top of this hour, backing President Trump's campaign to fire tens of thousands of federal workers and blocking a judge's order here that required the administration to reinstate employees in those 6 agencies that I mentioned. This is where we start our conversation with our political panel today. Republican strategist Rick Davis is here, partner at Stone Court Capital, Bloomberg Politics contributor, alongside Democratic strategist Kristen Hawn, partner at ROKK Solutions. It's great to see you both here. Rick, what does this tell you about not only this particular case? A lot of workers are not coming back to the office here in Washington. You might even be able to extrapolate that to suggest a lot more firings are coming. But also the Supreme Court once again aligning with Donald Trump. How do you rationalize all of this today?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think this is all core to the Donald Trump strategy, right? Which is not to go to Congress and ask their permission to do these things, but to do what you want to do as an executive branch of government and let the courts, the third branch of government, decide whether or not what you're doing is appropriate or not. And frankly, I mean, I think the strategy they have, which is, don't meddle in Congress, but keep things out of there and let the legal process determine these things, is kind of a 60-40 deal, right? If he gets 60% of these, judicial rulings in his favor, they're all going to be high-fiving in the Oval Office and thinking this is great stuff. We've just expanded the power of the presidency. So whether it's on this or immigration or tariffs, they're going to challenge the legal system, not the congressional mandate. So I think this is, this is a limited ruling. The Judge of Maryland still has a procedure out to determine whether other full-time employees were or being fired inappropriately or illegally. But for the provisional workers, they're gone. I mean, this is a pretty solid ruling for them to be able to take these, 16,000 workers and send them home. So I think it's a big victory for the Trump administration strategy around reducing the workforce in the federal government, and should open up other venues for them to try and find solutions to this on a legal basis. But look, I mean, they're going to win some, they're going to lose some, and at the end of the day, they are marching toward expanding the power of the executive branch of government.
That's for sure. To Rick's point, workers in 19 states and D.C. still must be kept on paid administrative leave at a larger set of agencies under that judge's order in a similar case in Maryland. Otherwise, everybody's going home here, Kristen, and I wonder your thoughts on this Supreme Court ruling. We'll get to the immigration ruling in a moment here, but in terms of expanding the executive's power, how many more layoffs could this lead to?
I mean, I could think it could lead to a significant number of layoffs. I think Rick's exactly right. This administration has made the determination, I'm not saying they're wrong, saying that, we're not going to deal with Congress. we're going to go through the judicial system. So until Congress takes its power back and addresses some of these issues, because the issue is, when you've got a president coming in issuing executive orders, the only way you really have long-term, stable policies that stand the test of time throughout multiple presidencies and different, Democrats and Republicans, people on both sides of the aisle who sit in that Oval Office, this is going to continue to happen, and we're just going to experience a lot of whiplash when it comes to not just the economy, but the workforce. And you're talking about a lot of these provisional workers too, who, it sounds like it's an easy thing, but you've got a lot of, this young blood, these new workers who are coming in into the administration, into the federal government, who are, would seem to be a lot of the people that we want to invite. We want to have new people there. We want to make sure that, we're continuing to have smart, dedicated people who are taking these federal jobs. And so, it's a real detriment to that. But I think people are seeing the effects of this, particularly when you look at some things like the Veterans Affairs, administration. You're looking at things that are really upsetting people, and it manifested itself in a lot of these, these demonstrations that you saw over the weekend.
Well, for those of you who thought the courts would be a check on the president, the Supreme Court at least, not so much here, in another ruling allowing President Trump to resume the deportations. Deportations under the Alien Enemies Act. Remember, this group of alleged Venezuelan gang members put on a plane to El Salvador brought us to this moment. The court granting an emergency request on a 5-4 vote. The flights will continue. There are some caveats. Here's Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt speaking earlier in the White House driveway.
What the ruling says is, as from yesterday forward, what we can do is we can still deport, but they are entitled to habeas in the court of confinement, which means all of these cases will go through Texas. There will be no more class actions. It will be 2 questions asked. Do you qualify under alien enemies, and are you a violent gang member? Are you a member of TDA? That's what will be asked.
All right, so there you go. They're going to be in Texas, and the court ruled detainees must have notice and a chance to make their case to a judge before deportation. That's pretty important, Rick. If that's the case, you're not loading a bunch of guys in shackles on airplanes. That's going to slow down this process significantly, won't it?
I don't know how significant it'll slow down. First of all, these investigations that Commissioner Holman has been describing, they build case files on these guys, and some of them as loose as what kind of tattoos they've got, and others have much more extensive jackets. And so the reality is, if it's just the Q&A, they're going to be able to do that pretty quickly. Look, I mean, we deported 25 people the other day. It's handfuls that the U.S. government can get their hands on with these folks. Some of them were pulling right out of prisons, so we know right where they are, and that'll be sort of the easy process going forward. It'll get harder when we have to track down gang members, but it does portend that what happens if they say, no, I'm not a gang member, like Mr. Garcia would have said out of Maryland, who was taken to a Salvadoran prison. He would have then been given, I guess, some more due process, which is what everyone has said he deserves. So I do think the Supreme Court has given Trump what he wants, which is license to deport under the Alien Enemies Act. And of course, that's the special powers that he has. But at the same time, expect some form of due process that, frankly, heretofore probably has not been followed.
Yeah, Rick mentions Abrego Garcia. By the way, that was Attorney General Pam Bondi. I want to be clear, not Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt in the White House driveway talking about this. Kristen, we've talked about Garcia's case. The administration admitted it should not have deported him to El Salvador. They called it an administrative mistake. Still in jail, profiled on 60 Minutes last weekend. Chief Justice John Roberts has temporarily stayed a lower court's ruling here that demanded he be brought back by last night. Does he ever come home?
I mean, I would certainly hope so. I mean, you talk about due process and how we just shouldn't be treating American, people living in this country. So, hopefully, I mean, the Supreme Court certainly is giving Donald Trump what he wants, but there is some semblance of due process going forward. So something like this doesn't happen. But when you have somebody like Mr. Garcia who has been put through an ordeal like this, and people take a look at this and they just don't think it's fair. It's egregious. And so, I think we'll continue to see some of these issues, but, for the administration to be so callous as to say, we're just not going to bring, we got it wrong, but we also don't have to bring him back. I think really rubbed people the wrong way. You put names and faces onto these stories, and it really resonates with people. And I keep talking about these demonstrations all over the country, where people have been rising up for any number of different reasons. And as we look towards the midterms next year, I think there are going to be serious repercussions for a lot of these, particularly, MAGA Republicans who are running in some of these more difficult districts. Because you're looking in states like Alabama, all 50 states across the country, and people is just not sitting well.
Rick, if you're President Trump now in a White House that's admitted it should not have deported this man to El Salvador, is there an opportunity to correct this? Welcome him back to the country, a photo opportunity, or that just doesn't play well politically?
Well, it wouldn't surprise you to learn that there's a lot of different information coming out of the administration. Some officials have also indicated that he's a member of a criminal gang. And so I doubt if they're going to be hugging him anytime soon. It would redefine the hug a thug kind of slogan that we used to apply to New York's judicial system. So the reality is they're going to claim a mistake, but they're not going to try and clean it up. And until the court forces them to do so, I think their view is this is a problem that the Salvadorans have to figure out, not their problem now. And to some degree, since they don't have access to the individual today, they have to make a political decision as to whether they look pretty callous and have disregard for the man's rights if they don't find a way to try and get him back.
Rick Davis and Kristen Hawn will stay with us. Our great panel today has much more coming in the second hour of Balance of Power. Thanks to you both, as we'll also turn our attention to the big story at hand here today, and that's tariffs. We're trying to get to as many storylines as we can in our 2 hours here on the fastest show in politics. But boy, they keep coming. Watching Wall Street as well, and a relief rally. We'll see how long it lasts. We'll also compare notes with Charlie Pellet, his take on the markets, and a conversation next hour with Congressman Pat Fallon, the Republican from Texas, brings his view here on the tariff program that takes effect at midnight. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. Glad you're along for the ride today. This is Bloomberg.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
It's the Tuesday edition as we count down to reciprocal tariffs taking effect at midnight and China pledging to fight to the end. Wouldn't know by watching Wall Street, though. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington with a relief rally underway. Kailey, hopes for deals to be announced by the White House, but nothing really has changed yet.
Well, no, certainly not. We know conversations are being had. We learned about negotiations with Japan yesterday. President Trump today says he's also talking with South Korea. But for another country in Asia, it seems that we will not be so lucky as to see a deal before midnight tonight, as China is suggesting they will not flinch. And this is a quote, when trouble comes our way. And the U.S. official now telling Bloomberg that the U.S. will be moving forward with what is a cumulative 104% tariff rate on China, effective 11 hours from now.
Yeah, midnight tonight is when all of this happens. You can cue the countdown clocks. Beijing responding, in fact, through China's Commerce Ministry. The U.S. threat to escalate tariffs on China, a mistake on top of a mistake, pledging to fight to the end.
Yeah, and the question is going to be, of course, what is the consequence of that fight, both here at home, in China, and elsewhere in the global economy? And that is why the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer has been facing some pretty tough questioning in the Senate Finance Committee today about the ramifications of these policies.
Some of those questions coming from Republicans now, more of them, as even Elon Musk begins to openly question the direction of this tariff program at odds with many others in the administration.
Peter Navarro specifically, they haven't had kind words for each other over the last few days. So we'll get into all of that this hour. Get the take from one Republican, Congressman Pat Fallon of Texas, will be joining us in just a few minutes. But first, let's check in on how the markets are digesting all of this. It is an up day, but not as much as we were, Charlie Pellet.
Indeed, Kailey, Leinz, Joe Mathieu talking about that midnight countdown clock. I tell you, I'm more concerned about the 4 p.m. close countdown clock as of now, because the gains that we saw earlier on, they are fading fast. Yes, very much in the green right now, looking at an advance of just about 0.4%. But keep in mind, during the early going, we had the S&P 500 index surging by 4%. Right now, we have got the S&P up 19 points, 5,082, where we stand up by 0.4%. Keep it locked into Bloomberg Television and Radio for the latest on these markets. The Dow up 300 points now, up by 0.8%. Nasdaq Composite Index up 20. That is a gain of 0.1%. The 10-year 4.16%, with the 2-year currently yielding 3.74%. Gold, little changed on the day right now. I'm calling it unchanged at $29.83. We've got West Texas Intermediate crude at 60 even a barrel, down 1.1%. Bitcoin right now down by almost 2%, 77,365 on Bitcoin. Barclays is scrapping its targets for boosting the diversity of its staff across the U.S., becoming the latest Wall Street giant to pull back policies amid pressure from Donald Trump's administration. Shares of Barclays, the ADR, is up today by 1.5%. And for the first time in 15 years, ExxonMobil facing no shareholder proposals this proxy season. Again, recapping, S&P 500 index holding on to an advance of 0.5%, but the key takeaway at this hour, well off session highs. Balance of power continues right now, and back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet keeping us apprised of what was buying the dip action today, maybe less so now as we're right around session lows. Perhaps the optimism that existed this morning around potential trade deals with U.S. trading partners is not necessarily feeling as optimistic anymore, as a U.S. official is reporting once again, or telling Bloomberg, that those 104% tariffs on China will go into effect at midnight, in addition, of course, to the reciprocal tariffs on all of our other countries and partners that we trade with that had already been announced last week. Although this is no surprise, as President Trump did say yesterday from the Oval Office that there was not going to be a pause for breath here.
Would you be open to a pause in tariffs to allow for negotiations?
Well, we're not looking at that. We have many countries that are coming to negotiate deals with us, and they're going to be fair deals. And in certain cases, they're going to be paying substantial tariffs. They don't want to be in the hands of the Chinese. And the Chinese have turned out to be really not very good at that. People that are with us, they're with us. But we cannot be taken advantage of any longer.
Although, as the president wrote on Truth Social, while referring to impending talks and a great call, as he called it, with the acting president of South Korea, he went on to talk about China. Also wants to make a deal badly, he says, but they don't know how to get it started. We are waiting for their call. It will happen. In the meantime, as Kailey mentioned, 104% combined tariffs set to take effect on China. And that's where we start our report from Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who joins us live from the White House. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe. So these tariffs expected to go into effect, those additional tariffs, midnight tonight. We have to keep in mind that President Trump had put forward a deadline of today for China to pull back on its planned retaliation that we are expecting to go into effect on April 10th, 34% levy against U.S. imports. We also have to keep in mind that the planned China retaliation includes some targeted action, including export controls against several critical minerals, as well as targeting some key U.S. agriculture sectors. We have to keep that in mind because that's going to keep coming up in these conversations, since we know that that is a pressure point for this White House. Reports indicating that senior administration officials are already starting to think of ways how they could potentially bail out farmers down the road if there is a significant loss when it comes to the U.S. agricultural sector. Also, as we look forward to what it could potentially take to make a deal, we do know from a statement earlier today, China saying that they would prefer a dialogue to resolve their disputes, but they are vowing to fight this until the end. You mentioned there that President Trump kind of reached out there of saying that he is waiting for the call from China, as we learned that some of these other countries are starting to call in, including South Korea and Japan.
Well, and I'm assuming we'll hear more from the White House just moments from now, Tyler, as the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt is scheduled to hold a briefing this hour. But President Trump also has an EO signing on his agenda later this afternoon. What can we expect to hear from him then?
Yeah, so Kailey, this executive order that he's expected to sign has to deal with American energy. According to our reporting, he's expected to try to designate coal as a critical mineral. We were just talking about critical minerals there, as well as try to boost mining of coal in the U.S. And Bloomberg News reporting that this is indicative of how this White House is trying to boost energy production when it comes to artificial intelligence, as well as data centers. Yesterday, as you know, President Trump in the Oval Office saying that he thinks the U.S. is leading the AI race with China, but one of the important parts to keeping that edge will be this electricity production.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live at the White House. Thank you so much. Now, as for how all of this is feeding into financial markets, we just got the run through from Charlie. Again, we are well off the highs of the session. What was at one point a 4% gain on the S&P 500 is now a gain of just 0.5%. And we want to get more on that now with Bloomberg cross-asset reporter Emily Grafeo. So, Emily, what was, it seemed, a buy the dip rally is fading pretty fast.
Yeah, we were experiencing our highest intraday jump in the stock market since November 2022, and that's fading. I think, Kailey, the rally is a little sensitive right now. People kind of came in this morning and were buying. It's faded a bit, but really the word on Wall Street is that we just don't know how this is going to end. We don't know where to go next, but one thing is certain, and that is that volatility is high. When you look at the dip buying impulse, I write about ETFs, so the data comes in like day after day. So we don't know the buying, at least for today, but we did see yesterday that impetus still to buy the dip. You look at the ETF TQQQ. This goes 3 times leverage on the NASDAQ 100. It had its biggest inflow ever yesterday, $1.5 billion into that fund. It could be traders. It could be people trying to actually buy shares to short the fund. So it's hard to really glean a signal out of it. But we do know that that impetus, at least to buy the rally yesterday or the dip yesterday, was still kind of showing up in the ETF flows.
Emily, thank you so much. Emily Grafeo, Bloomberg's cross-asset reporter, with her eyes on the markets. We'll see where we're at by the time we're done here at 2 o'clock. Remembering we had sizable gains when the opening bell rang this morning, as Kailey mentions, might be petering out a little bit here based on some of the news flow that we've been following. Congressman Pat Fallon, the Republican from Texas's 4th District, is watching all of this happen and joins us now live on Bloomberg TV and radio. Congressman, it's great to have you. We've been hearing a lot of concern from both sides of the aisle, certainly in this hearing this morning with the U.S. Trade Representative, about the impact of these tariffs and exactly what's going to happen after midnight tonight. Are you hearing a coherent message from the White House that you can support? Is the president going to make the country stronger at midnight tonight?
Absolutely, and I am hearing a coherent message, and that is that there are I just was with leadership, and they had just gotten off the phone with President Trump, and he said to them there was about 70 countries that have reached out to the administration and want to negotiate trade deals. So what it looks like it's shaping up, and I'm not going to panic at all, and I don't think anybody should, because things like this, you know, days and weeks, they should be measured in days and weeks. They should be measured in months and years. And I do think that we're going to see trade deals, really a cascade of them, that will strengthen this country, will put us in a better position, and I think the economy will show more strength.
Well, Congressman, as we consider that kind of time horizon, what are you telling your constituents about what they should be bracing for in the days and weeks ahead in the more short term compared to what you just described as the months and years ahead? Because this is consistently how we see it framed by this administration, short-term pain for longer-term gain.
I think really what you're asking, Kailey, is how short-term is short-term? Is it going to be a few weeks,
exactly.
Is it going to be a few months, et cetera? Don't have the crystal ball, but what I suspect will happen is that once we see these major countries making deals, like Vietnam, that would be that's a sizable deal. Obviously, the EU would be seismic, and then the markets will see, okay, we're seeing some steady stability, we're seeing some achievement, and you're going to see a slow isolation of China. And then it's up to them to make a deal. I know that they're going to have to save face and whatnot, but this trade war will hurt them way more than it will hurt us. We will experience some pain, no doubt, but they will experience it tenfold. So it behooves them to come to the table as well. And I think you'll see that. You just won't see it immediately for really, I think, egotistical reasons. When you deal with an authoritarian regime, that's juiced into the equation.
Well, they do like to buy some of our stuff as well, but we buy a lot more of theirs, Congressman. The U.S.-China Business Council finds that the 4th Congressional District, your district alone, exported $510 million worth of goods to China in the most recent year we have here, 2022. What could that mean for your local economy if those exports begin to slow?
The 4th Congressional District in Texas as a whole has a very dynamic economy, Joe, and if we were our own country, we'd be the 8th largest economy in the world. So 510 million, while that's a big number, you know what, our constituents are rooting for America and America's success. Unlike some other networks like CNN that was seemingly rooting for China, was an article I read yesterday.
Well, I wonder, sir, if more help will be required for their success if these tariffs indeed go into effect and last for some period of time. We obviously saw in the first Trump administration that farmers were offered subsidies. I wonder if you expect to see that again. Bloomberg has reported that Republican colleagues of yours are considering looking at potentially a tax credit for exporters. Would you be supportive of those kinds of measures? And is it worth it to spend more in order to raise revenue?
Yeah, I think it's too early to talk about that or really seriously consider it, but we need to strategically decouple from China. Obviously, we're going to trade with them even when this is over, but the over-reliance that we've had on our #1 geopolitical competitor is alarming, and really COVID should have woken us up to that reality. And we're far too reliant on the Chinese right now, and this, I think, is going to act as a wonderful instrument to start that decoupling, and that's going to make us stronger. And we need to have more diverse trading partners.
We're watching Wall Street turn negative here. We just want to mention, after starting with a powerful rally this morning, a relief rally that seemed to be defying gravity considering the news that hasn't changed too much around tariffs. As the Congressman mentioned, there was some hope for deals to emerge from these reciprocal tariffs, but hope appears to be fading on Wall Street. The S&P 500 turning negative. It's now up actually just by 4 points. The NASDAQ 100 is down by 24 points here as we make our way through the midday in trading. Congressman, are you hearing from constituents? Are they hitting the constituent line to ask about their retirement accounts?
There's a few folks, but it hasn't been really all that sizable yet, because again, if you're an investor in the markets, you know that what happens over days shouldn't really concern you. That's more of a weeks and months. So let's see what happens 2 months from now. Will the markets, I personally think that the markets will be much higher in a few months. And I'm maybe an eternal optimist, but I do think that this isn't going to last. This is just very, very short term.
Well, speaking of short term, as you look ahead 2 months, Congressman, I wonder what's going to happen in your chamber in just the next 2 days, because the Speaker would like to see a vote on the Senate-passed budget blueprint, which I know a number of your colleagues in the House have taken issue with. Is it your expectation that the votes are actually there for that to pass this week and for reconciliation to advance?
Well, that's a great question. We had a conference this morning, and it's going to be a challenge, to be very honest. I don't know if we're going to have the votes. I hope we do, because all this is doing is, this is, like you said, it's a blueprint to move the process forward. There will be then a final product. I personally would not vote for a final product that doesn't have significant cuts in spending, because we need to work toward balancing a budget moving forward, considering we have a $36 trillion debt and climbing. We need to take our fiscal responsibility seriously, not just on the campaign trail, but actually here in Washington, D.C. So I don't know exactly what's going to happen. We'll see. But if we don't, then we're going to have to work together, and we have to extend the Trump tax cuts. We have to have a plan in place to go, and be a bit more disciplined fiscally. And so I hope that we can get there.
The president writing on Truth Social last night, the House must pass this budget resolution and quickly with the caps lock on. Congressman, will this actually get out of the Rules Committee to get to the floor? That might be the most important hurdle here, considering some of the Republicans who are concerned about the level of cuts in this blueprint.
Well, Joe, what we don't want to do is take it to the floor and fail. So we really have to count the votes. We have to do the whip counts before that happens. And again, I hope that it will. We're going to be having dinner with President Trump tonight, and we'll be talking about that. And if we have it, we'll go forward. But if not, there's always going to be a third way. It's not binary with it's either pass or fail. There are going to be third ways to get to that success, but we have to do it together. We have to have currently 217 votes to move it forward. So again, I'm praying that we can do it.
And finally, Congressman, we just have 2 minutes left here, but given your seats on the Intelligence and Armed Services Committees, I wonder what you make of the other news we got from the president yesterday about direct talks with Iran to take place on Saturday. What is your expectation or your hope that conversations will be able to yield?
You know, I very rarely am going to oppose having a conversation with another nation state because, President Trump tried that in his first term with North Korea. Really nothing came of it. But I really applauded the effort, because why not talk? And as President Reagan said, trust but verify. So even if you came to some accord, you have to make sure that their actions match their rhetoric and the pages that they signed in any kind of an agreement or treaty. So I do applaud talking. But, Iran's on the run. They're not strong right now. Israel has decimated Hezbollah and decimated Hamas, and even President Trump with his latest strike on the Houthis in Iran losing Syria, they're on their heels. So we'll see. It could just be all rhetoric. It could be for show, but we'll find out.
Indeed, we will. Congressman, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Congressman Pat Fallon, Republican, representing Texas's 4th District, live from Capitol Hill with us here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio as we track what's happening in politics and how it coincides with what's happening in the markets. A brief dip lower on the S&P 500 after a rally of as much as 4%. Right now we're up just shy, or just around 20 points, up 0.4% on the S&P.
VIX barely budging, and Bitcoin is lower today. It's hard to make sense of all of this, but we'll continue with our political panel coming up next here on Balance of Power. Looks like we're getting another bid under this market, Kailey.
Yeah, we'll see if it lasts. This is Bloomberg TV and radio.
Thank you for being with us on the Tuesday edition here on Bloomberg TV and radio. The anxiety that's being felt over tariffs on Wall Street is being felt here in Washington as well. And not only by Democrats, most Republicans on Capitol Hill have been behind the Trump administration on this. Most who you hear join us on Balance of Power speak to the short-term pain, long-term gain aspects of this. But there are some Republicans now who are beginning to vocalize their worries. Senator Ted Cruz is one of them, referring to Elon Musk as the angel on President Trump's shoulder. Tom Tillis, the Republican from North Carolina, made his views clear today, unless he was just, Kailey, trying to get tape on himself in case the tariffs don't work out.
He is up for re-election next year.
We can play this back during a campaign. This was part of testimony of the U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer before the Senate Finance Committee. Listen to Senator Tillis.
In this scenario, the decision maker who decided the alla prima approach, who has obviously had to have spent time anticipating what we saw in the markets and some of the pushback. I'm assuming this all got gamed out because it's a novel approach. It needed to be thought out. Whose throat do I get to choke if this proves to be wrong?
Yes, that was the quote. Whose throat do I
that?
get to choke? Well, Jamison Greer kind of reluctantly said, you can always look at me or talk to me about that, sir, as the USTR. But we want to talk to our political panel about this. Rick Davis is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor and Republican strategist, partner at Stone Court Capital, alongside Kristen Hawn today, partner at ROKK Solutions and Democratic strategist. Rick, are we about to see some serious Republican on Republican violence, either metaphorically or physically speaking, over this tariff issue?
Yeah, I definitely think we're entering the era where there's very little anxiety between Democrats and Republicans, because Republicans basically see this as a win or lose proposition amongst themselves. So now the question is, between Congress and the administration, who's going to pay, right? I mean, Donald Trump's the decision maker. There's no question that there's not a policy-making apparatus that includes the trade rep that's going to decide these tariffs. So he can do all the damage he wants, but that's like, hitting the fodder, not the target. And so the reality is, I think you're already starting to see cracks in the congressional armor around Donald Trump. And there's legislation in the Senate that is bipartisan that would take away some of the leverage that Donald Trump has to do these tariffs. And it'll be interesting to see how far that goes, because that echoes the Senator Tillis's comments, which is, if I trust you and don't vote for that measure and take it back into my own control, who's going to pay the price when I go down in my Senate seat?
Yeah. How does this play out then, Kristen? I'm guessing you're kind of enjoying watching this conversation. Senator Ted Cruz says there are angels and demons vying for influence in the White House. Picture Peter Navarro on one shoulder, Elon Musk on the other. Apparently, Musk did directly appeal to President Trump over the weekend to keep the reciprocal tariffs from taking effect. It will impact his business at Tesla. Peter Navarro says he's not really a car manufacturer. He's an auto assembler. How does all of this end? Where's the rupture in the administration or in the party that you see coming?
I mean, that's a very good question, actually. We're only 4 months into this administration, if that. And you're kind of seeing, I mean, you look at what's happening. The markets are just one of the things that's happening. But, I think that the president has been Teflon for so long, and Republicans in the House and the Senate, for the most part, have stood behind him. And like you mentioned earlier, the talking point that everybody's using right now is that, this is a major disruptive policy. We knew that going in. We knew that there was going to be pain. I think he was saying you've got to operate or give medicine or something. If you break it, you bought it. But you're starting to see these certain cracks. And I think a lot of people are sitting there holding their breath, hoping that the markets rally and that, the tariffs had their Donald Trump's intended effect. But I think that there's going to be a lot of pain. And you're looking at, a country like China. And what is the impact of these tariffs going to be on, people across this country and their buying ability to buy goods and services? When, like it or not, we rely on a lot of cheaper goods that come in from China. So, people hired Donald Trump because they were being squeezed by inflation. They couldn't buy things at the grocery store. The cost of goods was far too high. But if he does stuff to make it worse, I think that you will see repercussions at the ballot box.
I want to go back, Rick, to this idea of the angel of Elon Musk and the demon of Peter Navarro, because they both clearly see each other as villains in this story if you judge their public comments about each other, including Elon Musk overnight saying Navarro is truly a moron. That is a direct quote, also calling him, quote, dumber than a sack of bricks. The White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, who is briefing reporters right now, was asked about this, and she says, boys will be boys, and we will let their public sparring continue. Obviously, Rick, these are grown men we are talking about in their 50s and 70s, respectively, but their public sparring, to allow it to continue, does that not undermine the messaging of this administration?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is just a cloud that kind of sits over the administration's effort to define what they're trying to accomplish on tariffs. And if it weren't such a dramatic impact, we've seen what's happened to the market since the president has embarked upon his tariff policy. you don't need a lot of noise in the system that's going to rankle those markets. And so the fact that one of the top advisors to the president, Elon Musk, who is also the world's wealthiest man and has 219 million followers on his platform X, is somehow picking a fight with the top trade policy person in the White House is crazy. I mean, no other administration would tolerate that. Either they'd be told to shut up and go to their neutral corners, or somebody would win that fight and the other person would be out of the administration. And so the fact that this is sort of gumming up what is already a challenging message narrative for the administration doesn't help the markets either. And so what we see today, after some optimism that there are going to be deals cut with places like Japan and maybe Israel, the prime minister was in the Oval Office yesterday talking about some of these things, has been overshadowed by the boys will be boys frat party fight, and China basically saying, as our largest trading partner, stick it. So, I mean, I don't know which narrative you like, but neither one of those are going to fit a productive political scenario.
Kristen, Kailey mentioned some of the nicer things that Elon Musk has said about Peter Navarro on Twitter. A couple of his posts were deleted, in fact, because they were so offensive. There's one that I could not read on the air here if I wanted to keep my job. Is this how it ends with Elon Musk? Peter Navarro went to jail, I think we could say, for Donald Trump. I mean, that's pretty loyal when it comes down to who's going to survive this fight.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you talk about Donald Trump, I mean, we've always talked about how he kind of runs, whether it's his business or the White House, like a mob boss. Dedication and loyalty seem to be the number one thing he cares about. So we'll see who comes out of this fight on top. But I totally agree with Rick Scott. I mean, I didn't think there was anything that could surprise me about this administration. But when you see two of the top advisors to the president of the United States publicly fighting, it's not good for anybody, particularly not their messaging going forward. So I guess we'll have to see this. What did they call it? A locker room? Maybe that was a previous thing they called locker room talk, or boys will be boys. That's just not a good answer. And frankly, they should come up with a better solution to this little spat.
Well, Caroline Leavitt has had to answer more questions than just about this little spat. She was talking about specifically tariffs and U.S. manufacturing being brought back by them. She suggested that the president thinks the U.S. has the workforce to make iPhones. Rick, this is, of course, as we consider the supply chains of companies like Apple who left China or started to diversify away from China to other countries that are also now facing incredibly high interest rates. Even if we had the labor supply, do we have the desire on the part of the American workforce to work in that kind of manufacturing? Is there not a reason why it was outsourced to other countries aside from just the cheapness of that labor?
Yeah, look, I mean, you're almost at full employment in the United States. So where you're finding thousands of workers who are going to go into a factory and assemble iPhones and things like that, it would be a challenge. And the fact is that none of those things can happen overnight. I think conservatively, they're talking years to be able to recreate the manufacturing and forget about the supply chain, because the supply chain, that all the parts and materials and technology that goes into an iPhone is also built in China. And so where's that supply chain going to come from? Because we're ill-equipped to start manufacturing the kind of components that go into these kinds of units. Why? Because they're done much cheaper in other markets. So I think a lot of this talk about how we're going to bring back manufacturing in the United States needs to be accompanied with what kind of manufacturing. Are we really going to become the low-cost producer in the world? Of course not. We don't want to be, because we aspire to better things for workers in America than, a sweatshop. So, I mean, the reality is when you really open up the Pandora's box on this kind of rhetoric, you really wonder what it is we're trying to accomplish. Good jobs, high-paying jobs, technical jobs that would encourage people to get better educations. Yes, those are the things we're looking for here in the U.S.
Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital, Kristen, Hawn, ROKK Solutions, our great panel. As Howard Lutnick said on CBS Sunday Morning, the army of millions of human beings screwing in little screws to make iPhones, Kailey, the kind of thing that's going to come to America. We'll see about that. Much more ahead here on Bloomberg. Stay with us on Balance of Power, live from Washington. We're live from Washington as we cover politics in advance of reciprocal tariffs taking effect at midnight, with the volatility that we've experienced today and the concern that many have about the global economic impact that these reciprocal tariffs will have on top of the baseline tariffs. Bloomberg's David Weston sat down to discuss it earlier today with the former Treasury Secretary. This was earlier today on Bloomberg, Larry Summers. Let's listen.
I feel better anytime instability seems to be calming, but be not confused. There's only one reason why instability is being reduced, and that is there's a growing hope in markets that a larger part of these policies are going to prove transitory and reversible. This does not reflect any kind of market endorsement of the approach that the president has followed. Rather, it reflects a judgment that the president might recognize the reality that markets are telling him about, that many of his advisors are telling him about, that corporate CEOs across the country are articulating, that this kind of wholesale tariff policy is simply bad for economic performance. We're seeing some signs that the administration may recognize that.
We're seeing signs, but do we have a better sense of the goals and the process today than we got from the Rose Garden last Wednesday?
I don't think so. I think this is fundamentally a improvisational effort. You could tell that when you knew that there was a policy based on tariff reciprocity that didn't use any data on the tariffs of other countries in figuring out how to reciprocate. You could tell that from the blatant contradictions between what Presidential Advisor Navarro was saying and Presidential Advisor Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was saying. You could tell that from the degree of division between close outside advisor Elon Musk and many members of the president's economic team. This is a policy, it's a hugely consequential policy, but by all appearances, it's being improvised on a daily basis, and that's creating huge uncertainty. But it's only uncertain, there's only uncertainty if things go in both directions. And today happened to be a day when things moved in a positive direction. I hope that the moves to back off these policies can continue, but we'll have to see. I suspect we're going to have volatile markets for some time to come, and no one can know, but my judgment is that I'd be surprised if the bottom is yet in with respect to this phase and markets.
How bad could it get?
Oh, I think the likelihood, I think it's more likely than not that we're going to have a recession. And in the context of a recession, we'll see an extra 2 million people be unemployed. We'll see losses in household income that are $5,000 a family or more. We're very likely, in the context of a recession, to see markets reach levels significantly below their current levels. So I think we could be looking for fairly serious economic problems.
That was the former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers in conversation with Bloomberg Wall Street Week host David Weston earlier today. Meantime, the current Treasury Secretary has just hit us with a fresh post on X about these tariffs, Joe. Scott Bessent saying President Trump's end goal is bringing back jobs and manufacturing to the United States, raising wages, increasing revenue, and reviving the American dream. He goes on to say that what they're trying to do is, quote, right the wrongs of long-standing global trade imbalances.
That's right. Different than raising revenue, for instance, to pay for tax cuts, as we seem to get together every day here, Kailey, to figure out which one it is. What is the drive? And maybe it's a combination they're in. Do baseline tariffs stay in place, generating that 10% to help fill coffers in the U.S., and we use reciprocal for negotiations? All of these questions are unanswered.
Well, and there are questions that we have as well for Greta Peisch, partner at Wiley, Rein, former general counsel at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, who is joining us now here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Greta, when we consider the prospects of this being a revenue raiser, if at least in part that is what the objective is here, to what extent will any revenue gains be offset by just lower trade between the U.S. and its trading partners? Because we've heard from many economic minds that it is expected that the actual volume of that trade will go down, and that impacts the overall number you could bring in, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. As you raise the tariff, you would expect demand for imports to go down. And in fact, that's what the administration says, that in part that's what they want to do by creating incentives to move manufacturing here. So if your primary objective is revenue raising, what you may want to do is have a relatively lower tariff on a broader base of imports, which sort of sounds like that 10% base that they've already put in place that came into effect on Saturday. Higher tariffs, of course, are going to drive import volumes down and ultimately lead to less revenue collection.
We heard from the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer in testimony earlier today. He's got 2 days' worth today in the Senate, where he spoke with Senator Bennett, Michael Bennett of Colorado, about the impact of these tariffs. Let's listen.
What is it the American people should expect to be able to suffer as a result in terms of rising prices?
I think there's not really a one-to-one on tariffs and price effects, and so many things go into price. I know you think I'm probably like dodging and weaving on this, but I'm looking at data.
I know you're smart enough to know that the likelihood is that prices are going to go up for the American people as a result of the tariffs.
Was he dodging and weaving there? I'm trying to understand where the administration is on this, because we hear a lot about a one-time impact. Wall Street's factoring in, it looks like, a lot worse.
Well, you know, it isn't so much a dodge and weave in the fact that, you know, inflation has a lot of components that go into it. It's a macroeconomic indicator that isn't just driven by tariffs. And in fact, often it's something else going on, the labor market, supply, demand. In the past, you know, we haven't seen tariffs drive inflation. Even in the first Trump administration, when tariffs went up quite a bit on China, and that felt like a lot at the time. Of course, now what we're talking about is much bigger. That action did not cause inflation or other tariffs that have been put in place in the Trump administration and other administrations. We just don't usually think of tariffs as being an inflation driver. This is a big experiment of a much larger trade action than we've ever seen. So in part, we'll have to wait and see and how it interacts with other parts of the economy. But I think his comment is valid in the sense of looking back at how we usually think about tariffs and their magnitude and their impact on the economy. It is a bit complicated as to how they get baked into prices and what their effect is.
Well, I'd like to talk about one specific magnitude of tariffs on one of our trading partners, Greta, and that is China, because in addition to the 20% tariffs that have already been put into place to combat what the White House argues is the trade of fentanyl, and 34% in terms of the reciprocal tariff rate it was already intending to impose at midnight tonight, the White House has confirmed today it is going ahead with that additional 50% tariff on Chinese goods, bringing the effective rate to 104%. With a level that high, Greta, what is realistically going to happen with the trade relationship between the U.S. and China and the flow of goods?
Well, like all of these tariffs, I think the big question is, what is the end game? What is the administration attempting to achieve with these tariffs? And it may be different, and likely is a bit different with respect to China than with respect to other trading partners. But I think a question here is this about decoupling from China? Is it to increase leverage to have a negotiation, which it seems like at times the president may have alluded to? Those are very different outcomes. And China is going to have its own, as every trading partner has, its own prerogatives and its own domestic economic and political imperatives that it has to answer to. And so, I think at this point, we don't fully understand what the administration's strategy, what the president is hoping to achieve with this further increase in tariff. But I think it's certainly going to be a consequential action and potential discussions with China going forward.
Does the U.S. Trade Representative's office model this, maybe in conjunction now with the Secretary of Commerce, to kind of play this out, to see what it is we're actually asking for? When you hear Howard Lutnick talk about iPhones being assembled in the U.S. once again, we heard from Dan Ives on that. The analyst said that would mean basically a $3,000 iPhone. Where becomes the line of diminishing returns when decisions like this are being made?
I mean, it's a great question. And again, we don't know what's in the mind of the administration and the president and what they're hoping to achieve with these tariffs and negotiations. Just a few minutes ago, the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, said that the president was directing members of the trade team to come up with tailor-made deals for trading partners that are unique with respect to the trade relationship, imports, exports, the barriers in each of those markets. So that indicates that, it may be a different scenario for each and every one of this over 100 trading partners. But again, we don't have a clear sense of what the ask is and what the end state is. Where do they want to be in 9 months, in 18 months? What do they want the tariffs to look like? And what do they want the results of any negotiations to be?
And finally, Greta, in our final moments with you, given that you were general counsel at the USTR, do you have any hesitations around the actual legal mechanisms with which President Trump is acting to enact these tariffs? Because there are now movements in Congress toward kind of wresting back congressional authority through a resolution to exert that Article I privilege to actually be the ones in charge of tariff policy. But how would all of this stand up in court?
Well, Congress certainly has the ability to take action to counteract or address the trade policies that have been enacted by the president so far. And yes, there are also rumors or in even one case that's been filed to challenge some of the tariffs that have been put in place since President Trump came into office. But I think there's a lot of question marks there. He is stretching these authorities in new ways and using them in a magnitude that hasn't been attempted before. But and so we just don't know what the courts are going to do with that and whether any of these challenges will be successful. But I would just say that even if the courts are successful, or even if litigants are successful in challenging some of the actions that have been taken place so far, the president has other tools and authorities that can be used to put tariffs in place. So, he is committed to this policy, it would seem. He thinks that tariffs are effective in addressing these issues, and he'll find a way to do it.
Greta Peisch, Wiley, Rein, former general counsel, the office of the USTR. Greta, many thanks for the conversation. We've got a lot more ahead. Hope you'll join us on the late edition of Balance of Power. That's at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.